Welcome. Welcome. Well, let's jump into our message today. It's Shabbat Hagadol, like Connie said, the great Shabbat, because it's the Shabbat before Passover, the Shabbat before Pesach. And of course, Passover begins this coming Friday, and it's kind of nice when Shabbat is the first day of Passover because we're already taking off, so it's like leads right into it. So on Shabbat Hagadol, I like to discuss kind of the whys and how-tos of Passover to help us as a community enter in a bit more fully and kind of know what's what and why we do some things. And so we do have some slides that Chaim put together, if we can get them up. I think they're on for the Zoomers, but not here, is that right? Well, we'll just figure it out. I want to thank Chaim for, he did all the slides and organized everything. And they came out really well, so that was really fun to work together on that. Okay, so Seder, this Friday evening, come if you've registered. We also have, we'll be Zooming it online if you can't make it in person. And then for the second night, I hope that you'll find a Seder in our community to go to, either host one, or if you want to find a Seder, I know a few people that have room at their Seder tables. I think we have room in it. I should talk to Raina first, but hey, I do that sometimes. Come on over. What? So, but Saturday night, come and make it a home kind of thing. I can talk with you throughout the week and teach you how to lead a Seder. So really try to enter in. Now the Seder begins with the why. And the children will sing around the table. We can sing it together. Why is this night different from all other nights? That's the big question. Of course, next slide. This is the night when the Lord brought the Jewish people, brought us out of bondage in Egypt with his mighty hand. Exodus 12:16. That's the season that we're in. So we gather as Jewish communities and Jewish families, we gather all around the world on Friday evening to remember the Exodus from Egypt. It's a remarkable thing. The spiritual birth of our people that happened over 3,000 years ago. We gather to remember. Passover is like the birthday of the Jewish people. We can go to the next one. The instructions for Passover span across the book of Leviticus, Exodus, Deuteronomy. It's amazing how many verses talk about Passover. This is a few sampling to get the idea. Keep it as a feast to the Lord. Observe the feast of Matzah, for on this very same day I have brought your ranks out of the land of Egypt. Remember. Reminder between your eyes, so that the Torah, the word of the Lord, will be in your mouth. Passover is a powerful sign that's to remind us who we are, and even more to remind us whose we are. It's a sign to remember the power of the Lord as he has delivered us with his strong hand. It's a sign pointing us back to the Torah given at Mount Sinai. It's a sign of God's love for Israel. It's a sign of God's covenant with Israel. And more, it's a sign that we're members of that covenant. That's Passover. In the Haggadah, we don't just tell the story of ancient Jews in the past. It's as if we were there with them, crossing through the Red Sea. We stood at Mount Sinai with our people together. And Passover is intended to link us all together as a Jewish community around the globe. Individual Jews, we come together with families around a shared table. And then our shared tables come together as Jewish communities, who then come together as all Israel, wider Israel, making Passover a sign of God's relationship with his people to the whole world. Now, if if Jewish communities are a sign within Israel, and then Israel is a sign to the world in this covenantal way, then I want you to consider how critical it is that Messianic Jews enter into Passover and drink deeply of what Passover is all about. Passover for us bears the sign of Yeshua. It bears the mark of the resurrected Messiah, the heart of God's covenantal relationship with Israel. Yeshua is the heart. And he's the mediator of this greater promise that Passover is all about, the greater deliverance. And this promise extends now to those who trust in Yeshua, to all peoples around the globe. And this is Passover for us. So Yeshua is the deeper sign of Passover. And we'll unpack this a bit more carefully at our Seder on Friday night. And this brings us to our second reason we observe Passover: shared community life in covenant with God and Israel. So the instructions that God gives us to remember and to observe and to keep the community, keep the Passover, they're intended to keep the community together. They're community instructions. Passover is not something that you can really observe alone. I mean, you can sit there with your matzah and your moror, and you can do that, but that's not what it's about. It's a time to be together. And most of the commandments that God gives us in the Torah are intended to draw us together around shared instructions and shared tasks. So God wants us to gather together around his tasks so that we can build a community around him. And you guys, you've done a project together. You've worked together as a family. Our big thing was the chicken coop. During COVID time, we built this chicken coop together, and it brought us together as a family. It was a shared goal that we could work together on, that our relationships were more important than the chicken coop, but it brought us together. That's what the mitzvot are in the Torah. They're Jewish tasks that God has given us in the Bible, and they span from loving your neighbor to honoring your parents to building a fence on your roof so that people don't fall off, to Shabbat, to the holy days, to Passover. And so Passover, as an example, helps us establish and maintain communities who come together by living out shared covenantal life with God and with each other. We come together around his task. We come together around his table. This is important. The tasks are not as important as the relationship that we establish around the communal act of faithfulness with God and with each other. So we don't observe Passover in order to be more loved by God. We don't observe Passover to become better saved or to get brownie points with God. Instead, we observe because we're already loved and approved of by God's grace, by his mercy, by his compassion, by what Yeshua has done for us. Because we're in a relationship with God as a community together. That's why we're here. God then gives us a community way of life. Passover then is simply part of the biblical way that God has given us as members of his treasured people to live out his life with each other in a shared way. And then as members of Yeshua, bound up in him, when we trust in him, we're even more so members of one another. You see, it's like an added layer to the depth of our relationships. And during Pesach, we share in the new life of Yeshua together. A third why. Pass the torch onto the next generation. In Exodus 3:8, we read, "You are to tell your son on that day, saying, 'It is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt.'" We just think of the past, 3,000 years. How many Canaanites and Jebusites do you know today celebrating their birthday? It's remarkable. 3,000 years. We're part of this ongoing covenant that has to continue, the door of a door, from generation to generation. The Lord has given us a generational task. And then as members of his covenant, we must pass the Passover on to our children. It's part of our mission for the Lord. Pass this on to our children. We can't lose it. So we don't communicate these truths through a one-time conversation. These truths are intended to be communicated through regular life. It's with your family, when you come together with your community. And on Passover, when we relive the Exodus story every year as if we were there. It's when you clean your houses together and you remove your chametz, making your relationships more important than getting the chametz out, but you do it together, you see. You don't want to get rid of your chametz and argue the whole time. It's not good.
It's not the point. You want to do this together in him, in life. When you eat matzah sandwiches and you have to stand out in the crowd because no one else is Jewish, and they wonder what's going on, and tuna and matzah and whatever it is, these seemingly trivial tasks, they become the framing of a greater story, not only in our own lives, but intergenerationally. This is what will frame our grandchildren's life. And it starts with us doing it now. Opportunities to talk about these things when you walk on the way, like we read in the Shema today. To read. That soul will be cut off from Israel. But we don't shy away from hard things. That soul will be cut off from Israel. Interesting. There's two basic instructions. Remove your chametz and eat matzah. That's really it. Remove chametz, eat matzah. So the first question we need to ask is, well, what exactly is chametz and what exactly does God mean by matzah? Now, matzah means puffed up. Oh, there, we're back up. Good work, guys. Matzah means puffed up. Chametz is not the leavening agent itself like yeast. Chametz just means grains that are puffed up. Now, long-standing Jewish tradition decided that leavening, or chametz, refers to 5 kinds of grains which, when rise, when put into water, they expand, and so they puffed up. Wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. So it's not the yeast itself, it's the grains. And matzah means drain out. So in the Exodus story, we're told to bake bread in haste, grind our flour, but bake it right away rather than let it rise. And so that's the difference between matzah and just crackers or something like that, is that the matzah, the flour was baked right away. The tradition is within 18 minutes after the flour is ground. And I fondly remember at Cheryl's house years back, a few years ago, right, in your wood oven, we milled the flour and ground it all together, and then set the timer, and then tried to bake the matzah within that time, and that was really great. Eating matzah is a positive commandment to remember the Lord's deliverance. It's something we do together. And not only do we not eat anything containing these grains, apart from the matzah, but we also remove them from our houses. We clean our homes, chametz, everything throughout the house, and have fun with it. I just want to say have fun vacuuming, doing this thing, make it fun. A few years ago, we made a fun video with the kids. Maybe I'll send that out again of like Star Wars and the search for chametz. Now, there are two sides to this. On the one hand, the Torah emphasizes removing chametz again and again and again. It's very strong. And the consequence, like we said, for eating or not removing your chametz is that you'll be cut off from your people. That's really strong. Rather than see this as a punishment, I don't see it like that, like a policeman and a punishment. Perhaps we could see it more as a natural consequence. When a person doesn't participate in God's life as a community, it's as if he or she is removing himself from God's life. It's removing yourself from the community that God has given you to live within, and therefore you're cut off because you're not participating, you're not entering in. So the entire community suffers. And the same thing on Shabbat morning, like you're not here, everyone suffers. It isn't just about you, it's about all of us together. And I wonder if this is so important to the Lord because our food storages in our homes, think of your cupboard, it's like the heart of our house. Cheryl, you know about bread. Bread is like life itself. Bread is the heart of our meals. Removing all the breads and the leavenings from our houses and altering our diet is something that everyone in our family, in our communities, is affected by. It's something that our families and communities need to gather together to observe because it requires an explanation. It requires a conversation. You can't do this without talking about it, On the other hand, Jewish life is not all or nothing. Instead, it's something we participate in. Again, do the best we can. So if you aren't able to do a big clean this year, just let it go. Maybe next year. Maybe just do a little bit. Spend 5 minutes. Go through your cabinets and pull some things out and put them off in a corner in your basement or something like that. Remember, what's more important for us is the heart. Come together in community through this shared experience. Remember the Lord's great work. Be a sign and pass on his covenant to our children. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Very, very quickly, Jewish tradition took this idea of matzah and chametz and spiritualized it. And there are different voices in the Jewish world that pick up on this. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, we're at the next slide, uses these traditions in 1 Corinthians 5, 6 through 8. And let me read this passage because it's so beautiful. Don't you know that a little chametz leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old chametz so that you may be a new batch, just as you are unleavened. For Messiah, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the Passover, not with the old chametz, the chametz of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread, the matzah of sincerity and truth. Isn't that a beautiful passage? So you are the matzah. And Yeshua's work in you and in your family and in our community is this like this new matzah that we need to live out. Let us celebrate this Passover with the true bread of life at our tables, the life of Yeshua, the heart of our Passover. Now, the next way that we observe Passover is to take off from work. And in Exodus 12:16, the first day is to be a holy assembly, we read, as well as the seventh day. No manner of work is to be done in these days except what is eaten by the people, so you can cook. That's the idea. And that is what you can prepare. So biblically, it's the first and the seventh days. Those are Shabbat. And we're asked to take off from work, from business, from spending money. So this year, the days to take off from work, if you're able, are Shabbat, which you're already off, so that's easy. And then Friday, April 22nd, next Friday, is the day that would be off. Now, what's at the heart of this? Why? It's not just do this like in this legalistic way. What's the heart? Creating the space, creating the time for our families and our community to come together around these shared community tasks and to do life together. If you don't take off, you miss it. I mean, that's it. It's like it's a natural consequence of it. If you take off, you do. And I've experienced that as I've gone through kind of my own journey and growing and whatnot of, like when I really enter in and I really clear my schedule, Passover becomes much more meaningful and something happens inside and God can do a work inside of me. And when I don't, then I miss that. I'm not into like punish, but I miss it. That's the thing. I miss something. So lastly, I want to discuss the tradition of the Seder itself, the Passover Seder. Where does this come from? Through attending a Seder, even though attending a Seder, it's not a biblical commandment to have a Seder. It's not in the Torah, go have a Seder. But the Seder is a tradition that ensures that what is commanded is happening. It's like the way that we pull this together. Chaim, you can go to the next slide. First, the Torah instructs us to retell the Passover story to our children. So we've talked about this. The Seder gives us this opportunity to be very intentional. The word Seder just means order, and it's the order where we retell this story and keep it alive for thousands of years. So Jews of past, this is way even before the first century, Yeshua came into this tradition, lived this tradition out. They said, well, how are we going to pass this on to our children? Well, let's do it as we participate and observe the Passover, and let's have a meal together, and let's call it a Seder. So, second, the Torah requires this feast. It says have a feast. So we're to gather together with a family and with community and feast on Passover. The Seder is the structure to have that feast. Next slide. Thirdly, the Torah instructs us to eat the Pesach lamb with matzah and then with bitter herbs with our family. Pesach lamb, matzah, and bitter herbs. That's like the core meal of the feast. Now, just before the death of the firstborn plague, each family, we know the story, is told to slaughter a lamb and paint the blood of the slain lamb on the doorposts of their homes. And when the destroyer comes to strike the Egyptians, he would pass over the blood of the sacrificial lamb, covering our firstborn from death. And then every Jewish family is instructed to make this sacrifice every year. And we read in Deuteronomy that these lambs are to be sacrificed in the temple, requiring Jewish families even to do more, to drop everything and travel to Jerusalem every year on Passover. Josephus, who's a first century historian, tells us and gives us a glimpse into the first century Passover Seder experience. And I'll just kind of give you a visual here because it's so cool. You can imagine in the first century, hundreds of thousands of Jews coming in to gather around in the temple courts. And it wasn't just like they had one lamb. Everyone brought your own lamb. So there's hundreds of thousands of lambs going on, which you couldn't do in one day. It was done days before leading up to Passover and days into Passover. So when you hear like, oh, there's one day when the 1 hour when the Passover was killed, that's not necessarily wasn't happening in the first century. It's much bigger than that. And so you can just imagine how crazy this scene would be. You know, people are selling lambs, people are buying lambs, there's kids running around, there's noise, there's animals, there's all kinds of things, it's carousing. And what happened was you had to kill your own lamb for your family to eat. But then your lamb's blood would need to get onto the altar. Only the priest could go into the altar. So what they did was they set up a long line of priests from the altar all the way out into the temple courts where they would sacrifice the lambs. And you would take your lamb and bring the lamb up, and you would slit the throat of your lamb, and the blood would drain into a bowl. It were these gold and silver bowls that were rounded at the bottom so the blood didn't harden. And then the priest would pass the bowl to the priest here, and the next priest, and the next priest, and they'd pass a clean bowl here, and a new person would come up, and your blood would get carried all the way over here, and then your blood would get poured out on the altar. And then you would take your lamb, and you would go to cleaning stations that they had set up in the temple courts, and you would clean the lamb and skin the lamb and prepare the lamb and everything, and then you bring the lamb home, and that would be your Passover meal. Now, the tradition of the Seder developed very early during temple times. Jews would join in with the Levites. The Levites would be in the temple courts, and they would sing Hallel. They would sing psalms of praise. And they would be singing all day long during this time. And so what would happen is the Levites would continue to sing these psalms at home with their families while they ate their lamb and their matzah and their bitter herb. And this is how Hallel became a part of our Seder. Today, we sing Hallel. And it's remembering how the Levites would come, and this became a part of the first century Seder. Then the head of the household would tell the story before they ate to fulfill the biblical commandment. And we find recordings of early traditions of haroset and kiddush over the wine, and Seder cups and bitter herbs, and the dipping of the herb to reenact the hyssop on the blood on the doorframes of the houses. Later, in Jewish tradition, we developed the questions and reclining to our freedom. So with no temple, we aren't able to sacrifice the Passover lamb, of course. We're not going to go take a lamb and sacrifice it out in the parking lot. The Seder is where we remember and enter into this Passover offering experience. And we have the bone that reminds us of this. We still eat the matzah and the bitter herb, even if we don't have the Passover offering. And the shank bone that sits right here. And I just, it's really remarkable. We're going to get into this more on Friday, but we have a glimpse into the first century Seder in Yeshua through the Besserot, through the Gospels. In Mark 14:12, we read, "Now on the first day of Matzah of Passover, when they were slaughtering the Passover lambs," imagine that scene we just talked about, leading up to days into Passover. "When they were slaughtering the Passover lamb, Yeshua's disciples say, 'Where do you want us to go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?'" And when Mark says eat the Passover, that means eat the lamb that Yeshua or one of the disciples was going to sacrifice in the temple, just like we heard described from Josephus. So they went through this. They did this with matzah and with bitter herbs. And it's a whole other topic to get into. The different Passovers, there were different calendars, an ancient Israelite calendar, a Judean calendar, and Yeshua's disciples come in and they celebrate Passover on the ancient Israel calendar, and then Yeshua goes up on the cross while they're still the Judean calendar, and they're still offering more sacrifices, and he becomes the Passover offering for us. It's an amazing thing how all of these things come together. And they gather around the table that night, and Yeshua, they retell the story. And Yeshua highlights the symbolism of the matzah and the cup and the kiddush to frame his redemptive suffering and his death. And then what do? They sing songs of Hallel as they close. You see, they celebrated the first century Seder. So why is Yeshua's last meal a Passover Seder? Come this Friday, we're going to open that up even more. And we'll see how God uses the Passover story to frame Yeshua's life, his death, and his resurrection. And then we'll see how even things like the afikomen, a broken piece of matzah that Jews around the world eat as they close the Seder to remind us to taste the Passover lamb, reflects when Yeshua instructed us, "This is my body. Take this matzah and break it and eat it, because It is me. I am your Passover lamb. Do this in remembrance of me. This is, of course, before he goes to become our eternal Passover. Now we add layers and layers to our Passover story. And participating in the life of our Jewish community through the Seder is, for us, sharing the life of Messiah and his great redemptive work in the world. So, to close, Passover is a journey. I've covered a lot of ground. We've covered some whys. We've covered some how-tos. Just remember that doing everything isn't as important as entering into community life and doing some. So jump in where you can. And maybe that's attending a Seder this year. Maybe that's taking one of the days off. Maybe that's entering more fully into Yeshua's life this Passover. Whatever you do, stay focused on the heart, coming together as a Jewish community in Messiah to bring these important Passover instructions, building the foundations to life in our hearts and in our homes, in our families, and in our Ruach Israel community. So, Chag Sameach, happy Passover in advance, and Shabbat Shalom. And I'm going to invite up our cantor, Shana.